Well, welcome everybody. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be able to introduce Jim Johnson, to have him here at the school today. Jim Johnson has the kind of career that you can all only hope for. He is one of
Happy to share it.
Be careful what you say. Jim has been, I think, one of the most influential and thoughtful participants in both the political and the policy process for a generation. He's played enormously important roles in and out of government as advisors to presidents and vice presidents and candidates and corporate leaders and the nonprofit sector. A great model of public service, which is what we're all about here, and a proof that public service is something that takes place sometimes in government and sometimes doing other things, but always with an eye to what makes us a better country and better people. You've all seen the extent of the resume. My first personal encounters with Jim was when he was working for Vice President Mondale, and I was a lowly special assistant at the Justice Department, handling a variety of strange problems for then Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti. But as a measure of the mark that the kind of person Jim is after we lost in 1980, I went to work on the Hill for Senator Kennedy, but was kind of a little uncertain about where my own career was going, and I called him up out of the blue, and not really somebody who was all that well known to him, and I said, "Can I come down and talk to you? And how do I get to be Jim Johnson?" And so he spent an hour with me in his office at that time, which was the founding days of Public Strategies, as I recall, of which we have very many distinguished members and friends here in the audience today, and Jim gave me some very, very good advice about how to think about careers in and out of government, and so I've been grateful for his friendship and his counsel for a long time. As I said, he's been not only the sort of key advisor to Vice President Mondale during the Carter presidency, but has really been a critical and valued confidant of candidates and presidents ever since. And from that perspective, obviously, has a lot of insight onto the topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is presidential transitions and how to think about them. An obviously timely and relevant topic as we move into this election year. And so, without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Jim.
Thank you. I'll say not too much, and then we can have questions and discussions and so on. Well, first, thank you, Jim, for having me. Thanks for the great job you're doing here. Thanks to Jean Lambrew for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I have a special warmth in my heart for schools of public affairs. I was a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. I was a faculty member there. I was an assistant director of the graduate program there. I currently serve on the visiting committee for the Kennedy School at Harvard. I'm on the advisory board to the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, and have watched this kind of education for a long time. And my career has had a lot more of a business component than a lot of people who go through schools of public affairs. But what I learned at Princeton in the years I was there in the Woodrow Wilson context has been enormously valuable, both in the business world and in the nonprofit and government world. There are lots of friends in the room, but I want to say a particular word about Jack Martin, who's the president and chairman and CEO and life leader of Public Strategies, PSI. Jack and I have been friends for a very long time, and I know that you have a number of graduates of the school who work with you, and it's a great company that does great work in the public affairs field. And also my friend Kenny Jastrow is right here, who's the CEO of Temple Inland, and now the chairman of Guarantee Bank and four-star real estate firm, all located here in Austin. And I have been a director of Kenny's company for the last 8 years, and so two of my closest friends anywhere, not closest friends in Austin, closest friends anywhere, are kind enough to be here. So thanks, Jack, thanks, Kenny, and to others in the room, including my cousin, Emily Anfinson, who's been here for the last 3 years working at GSD&M and has made had a great time in Austin, can't I say? Right. So anyway, the immediate reason I think that it occurred to Jim that we might discuss this topic is that I have, as he has, been involved in a number of presidential and vice presidential transitions, and I find it an absolutely fascinating area. The most recent exposure I have is that I was asked by John Kerry in the summer, in 2004, John Kerry asked me to do a number of different things, and I ended up spending most of the year working maybe 2/3 of the time on John Kerry's business and a little less on my own business. I'm also a partner in a private equity firm, and but that was a little bit negotiable. And so John first asked if I would run the vice presidential selection process for him, which I did, which was fun and interesting. And if anybody wants to ask about that, we can talk about that later. I then, with my good friend Vernon Jordan, negotiated the debates with the Bush people.
You know, by the way, that Vernon is going to be our commencement.
I do know that. Yeah, I do know that. And he's already asked me for the commencement speech I gave at the Humphrey School a year before that. So if you hear any of this stuff twice, right, I would happy to share it. In any case, then in July of 2004, John Kerry asked if I would head up the transition planning effort. And the planning for transitions in the U.S. presidency has changed a lot, since Truman and Eisenhower, and in the Kennedy transition, 1960, he asked Clark Clifford, the famous Washington lawyer, if he would head the transition effort, and he brought in the day after the election a single memo, and said to President Kennedy, "This is your game plan for how to lead through the transition period and up to inauguration and the first part of your presidency." When we were doing this in 2004, ultimately, of course, our paper and our thought and our strategy and our integration of all the important challenges was of no value whatsoever because Kerry didn't happen to win. But we had several hundred people involved, and we had a very active planning process involved. And I thought it might be useful to start out just briefly talking about the scope of all of this challenge of getting a presidential transition right. We had in our Kerry plan in 2004, we had a first 10-day period, then a second 10-day period, and then from Thanksgiving to Christmas, and then from Christmas to Inauguration Day, it was in that year 78 days. And so if you look at that time period, you have an enormous number of things that you have to do at once. The first, and in some respects, and Dan Bartlett knows about this as well, the first thing you have to do is make sure that you interpret the results of the election properly, so that you describe the mandate that the voters have given you, so that you're not just there as an extension of your candidacy, but you're now incorporating the majority views of the American people and characterizing their votes as support for your perspective on the future of the country. And so defining that mandate is a very, very important step. The second thing that happens is that once you've been elected president, people view you very differently. And they're looking for more about what's inside and what are your most important values and what's your most important commitments, what's your most important orientation to changing the country. And of course they also want to deal with what's gone before, so that getting the right balance of continuity and change turns out to be of critical importance. The president has about 7,000 appointments to make. There are 1,100 appointments by the president that have Senate confirmation. And so you're looking at that. In the first 20 days, our goal in 2004 would have been to have the president select and announce the first 69 appointments. We felt that in the national security area and in the economics area, as well as the White House staff, we basically had to move in November in order to show the kinds of people and the kind of approach to governing, the kinds of values, the kind of orientation that a President Kerry would have through the quality and nature of his initial personnel selections. So we were working very hard to marry up the quality of the people and the nature of their previous careers and the nature of their possibility for success in government with the key campaign priorities that Senator Kerry had been talking about. If you imagine the size of this task, I was asking questions this morning about the University of Texas. I gather about 50,000 students, maybe 10 or 12,000 employees, and if you imagine these first 69 that we wanted to do in 20 days, and you imagine the average job, with lots of different changes, and this is a gross generalization, being sort of roughly similar maybe to being president of the University of Texas. So if you just imagine between now and say the 10th of March, choosing 69 new presidents of the University of Texas is a big job. When you choose a new university president, you take normally a year or two. You do it one at a time. You're looking at one set of skills as opposed to 69 different sets of skills. And our goal was to have 300 selections made by Inauguration Day. So that is obviously extremely daunting. You also have to, of course, make sure that you have the right messages that you're sending. But also you have to know the terrain that you're going into. And so one of the things that these transitions do, and Jim, you might want to say more about this as well because it's so critical, and that is that what you're going into is defined by executive orders that expire or that you might want to do, by legislation that expires or that you need to initiate fresh for the future. And we had a plan, as has been the case in many previous transitions, to have an organized liaison with every significant department in the federal government. And so we had hundreds of people lined up, in many cases people who were previously assistant secretaries or previously deputy secretaries or whatever, to go back into a federal agency and establish a dialogue with the people who were departing office. But that combination of legislation that you're faced with, executive orders that you want to do or that you want to get rid of or that you are expiring for one reason or another, the agency liaison with a very, very broad range of federal agencies turns out to be a very sizable task, so that the scope of all of this is really overwhelming. One of the things that John Kerry worried about, and this is something I hope we'll have a chance to discuss, is that, and interesting enough, John McCain made a comment, Mark, about this the other day. A lot of people in politics are A, superstitious, and B, paralyzed about the notion that somebody's going to think that they're taking winning for granted. So that as we go from now, whether Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama is nominated, with John McCain being virtually to the point of being nominated, we're going to now look at a period of time between now and the November election where they're going to be, I guarantee it, totally schizophrenic about whether or not they want to do serious transition planning. And they're going to think that everything they do is going to be discovered. They're going to think that everything they do is going to be presumptuous if seen. And then they're going to realize as they get into October that they have no idea how to meet the standards that will be imposed upon them for the month of November. And we went through this back and forth as we were presenting to John Kerry, and he'd say, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about that. And we'd say, well, if you're going to do a Secretary of State and a National Security Advisor announcement in the first week after the election, we got to be serious. If you're going to do a White House Chief of Staff in the week after the election, we got to get serious about it. And so one of the things that goes through this whole personnel process as well, which is something I spent an enormous amount of time on when I was working on the vice presidential selection, is how you do the proper, what's called in Washington, vetting, what normal people would call background checks, and where you do the kind of background checking on people to make sure that they are who they appear to be, that they have no conflicts or dimensions of misbehavior, should we say, that you'd rather not have in the public sphere. And the FBI, of course, once you have been elected, is generally at your disposal, although sometimes that gets a little more sticky than it should in terms of their availability and how fast they do things and how they do things and how disruptive they are and all that sort of thing. But one of the things that made John Kerry particularly nervous in 2004 is that we started a process with about 70 people of doing what we called a preliminary public vetting, where we took, and it's easier now in the internet age, where we took 70 people with teams of lawyers who were working for our transition planning effort and started doing all of the background research that we could do on people, from everything they'd written, everything they'd said, everything that was in the public sphere, anything about their finances or medical condition that was in the public sphere. We basically did all the public work on about 70 people because we couldn't afford to start on what is expected now to be a timetable of announcement of people after the election. And this made him enormously nervous. And it will make John McCain enormously nervous, and it'll make Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton enormously nervous. And because, of course, there is a big bifurcation between people, and I know Jim has written about this and will probably want to get into it more, but the people who tend to be the most valued in the campaign process are not typically the people who are most valued in much of the governing process. It's a little different in the White House itself, because some of the skills that you need in terms of presentation and some of the skills that you need in terms of managing complex issues and lots of them at once and so on are different. But the first transition I was involved in any depth was in 1976. And Jimmy Carter who was a planner, an engineer, somebody who took things extremely systematically and seriously, had a major transition effort. And the day after the election, I was Mr. Mondale's sort of right-hand man at the time, and I was given every word that had been written by the Carter transition planning effort. And we closeted ourselves for a couple of days and read every word of what was done on the Carter transition effort, and including President Carter's marginal comments back to the transition team of, I don't agree, or be bolder, or don't do this, do that, whatever, which was extremely instructive. And then it turned out that nobody had ever managed to think through the merger of the people who had gotten Jimmy Carter elected with the people who were doing the transition planning or who might take major roles in the administration. And there was a short battle that ensued, at which point the political people emerged totally in charge, and the transition books that I had all worked my way through, and Mondale had worked through much of them, were in the trash heap not too far away, because there was never a proper melding of the people around the political process and people around the transition planning process. Now, in some of the areas, and this is one of the areas that, should I call you Dean Steinberg? Is that better? That Dean Steinberg has written about.
That's my cousin, Dean. That is Dean.
Anyway, Jim has written about this because it turns out in the foreign policy and national security and intelligence areas, there's a little better overlap traditionally of the candidate not spouting off as much in those areas during the campaign, not disrupting too many things as much in the campaign, and also the people who tend to emerge in the campaign staffing on the national security and foreign policy side tend to be people who have had very substantial government experience and tend to be the kind of people who generally you would be inclined to appoint once you get into office. And so there's a little less disruption there typically on the national security and foreign policy side. But nevertheless, there have been many cases where major electoral issues, all the way back to Kennedy's win in 1960, where there were major foreign policy issues which were driving voting concerns and voting conclusions. And once the president got into office, found that there had also to be fairly major adjustments to what had been said about foreign policy and national security during the election. So that's a kind of a broad range of scope and challenges and so on. I did have a chance to think about some of the most significant questions, I think, for both sides as we go through this 2008-2009 transition. And maybe I'll just quickly lay those out on the table a little bit, and maybe those would be some of the things we'd want to discuss as we get I guess as we go now into November, December of this year, there unquestionably is going to be a preoccupation with economic policy and a preoccupation with Middle Eastern policy that's going to flow from this election. Jim Baker, when he came in to the transition in 1980, identified 87 senior appointments in the federal government on economic policy that he had to control, he said publicly, to give him any chance of controlling economic policy. And he had a whole separate operation around these 87 people who were all throughout different departments and in the White House and the Council of Economic Advisors and the Office of Management and Budget and so on. And so he had those 87. And so whoever's going to do the economic and budget thinking, given that both Democratic candidates, if they should win, have very fundamental disagreements with things that have been done in the Bush 43 period. That will be obviously a very big question as to how do you marshal your economic perspective and communicate in a way, and where are we in the business cycle? Are we in recession? Are we not in recession? Are we in stimulation land still or not? And how do we recover from all the market dislocations that are underway at the moment? There obviously also will be a major league set of questions around Iraq and Iran and whatever happens by way of the extraction of troops and military commitment from Iraq, and that will dominate an enormous amount of activity. There will, of course, be some of these perennial questions, and that is, how much work can you get done before the election? How much work will the candidate let you get done before the election? We'll be back into the question again of how do you integrate the people who got the candidate elected from the people who are going to help him succeed as a president. How much overlap is there among those people? Another very big question, which I think President Reagan deserves the A++ on this dimension. But probably the biggest single policy dilemma for a newly elected president is how to figure out how to damp down expectations for people who thought that when they voted for the president that whatever their issue was going to be issue number one. And there are probably about 35 different issue number ones that all the candidates will be saying to all the people who are potentially voting on that issue, in the end, yours is at the top. In one form of winking or another, they will be communicating that. And of course, once you get there, only one or two things will be at the top. And in this next administration, whether it's economic growth, whether it's healthcare reform, whether it's global warming, whether it's energy independence, there will be one or two dimensions that will clearly be at the top, and that will define the overwhelming legislative priority of 2009 for whoever is elected. And maybe you can do a couple of things, but if the most severely criticized transitions in modern times have been the Democratic transition. The Carter transition was very severely criticized, and the Clinton transition was very, very strongly criticized as being largely incoherent, not convincing as approaching the government with a strong management orientation, and they were, in fact, diverted into a lot of waste of time issues, or worse than that, dissipate public support kinds of issues like gays in the military and a variety of other things that nobody intended. I mean, people intended to address, but they didn't intend that would be the most important focus of activity in the Clinton White House in the first 6 weeks. And so that I think Ronald Reagan deserves the highest possible marks for what was done in '81 in terms of his defense and economic concentration and the discipline with which they focused on getting the needed legislation, particularly on the economic side. And I think that will be something on everybody's mind once again. I also think that there will be a dimension, whether it's McCain or Clinton or Obama, come November. As a last point here, I think there's going to be a big question as to whether or not the kind of people attracted to government and the kind of energy that's brought to government and the kind of independent mindedness that I would particularly associate with McCain and Obama has some sort of practical implication. Will this be more bipartisan? Will this be less Washington-centered? Will this be more people who represent a more diverse point of view? Will we have a kind of expression of this desire for change that you're going to be able to see in the new administration? Now, everybody's talking about change these days, and I think John McCain has no reason to take a back seat to anybody in that discussion because he's been a very independent-minded person in public life. But I think also this time, I think that with all the discussion of Washington and where the problems are and what's yesterday and what's tomorrow, and I think there's going to be a particularly strong focus on whether or not the new president seems to be more bipartisan, more encouraging of a broad range of views, and whether or not they capture some of the energy in the country for a new generation of service in the federal government and in American politics. Because what Kennedy did in that regard in 1960 was extremely important. And if you look at all of the outward signs now of people's desire to have something different and to be a part of something different, I think that is the primary public opinion message of 2008 at the moment, and that is that people are looking for some fundamental change. It may come in a variety of different ways, whether it's the first woman president or the first African American president or a independent-minded Republican president. I think we're going to see an enormous amount of change in Washington, and being ready for that and doing it skillfully, I think will be a major challenge. So with that, I'll stop. Do you go next, or do we take questions next?
Let me just make a couple of comments, and then thank you first.
Please, feel free to go on as long as you like.
But I thought I'd like to amplify on a couple of pieces, and I'll start where you ended off. When I think about these things, as those of you who've taken my policymaking course know, I tend to think about issues of people, process, and ideas. I want to talk a little bit about each of them in the transition context. On the people side, this last point, Jim, I think is really interesting and important because in addition to the things that you mentioned, the problem of who was important in the campaign and whether they're the right people for governing, there's a tendency, and I'd be interested in your reflections on this from your experience, is that when you think about these things, you tend to think about them a little bit like sandlot baseball, which is you pick the next best good player. But you don't think about it the way a general manager thinks about a team, which is what's the team. And so what tends to happen is that you're thinking about who'd be a really good Secretary of State, who'd be a good Secretary of Commerce. And it's part because it's very hard to think about the question about once you pick them all, could they actually function effectively together? And yet the lesson, I think, of presidencies, and particularly early years of presidencies, is that very often what looks like a lot of very good picks of individuals turn out to not work very well because they're just very dysfunctional as a team. They don't work together well. They're too separate. There are lots of different reasons why teams don't work. And this has been true of Republican and Democratic administrations. You can think back to, you could talk about the good sides of early Reagan. I just remind you what the national security thing looked like with Richard Allen and Al Haig. It just couldn't have been worse. And it was not that they were obviously bad choices. Haig had enormous experience, both as a military officer and at the White House. Allen was a respected guy in his own way. But it was an awful functioning. And we have our own memories of various secretaries of state and national security advisors and on the Democratic side. And so it's a problem because it's very hard to prepare and think those things through. And it may be even more challenging if, as you suggest, is likely, that the interest this next time around is to be more independent, to be more diverse, to get people who come from different backgrounds.
And maybe even more bipartisan.
And more bipartisan. And so, for example, it's always attractive to bring in somebody from the other party. In President Clinton's second term, he brought in Bill Cohen, a former Republican senator. And yet there are some advantages that brings, but there are also some tensions and difficulties in terms of their working, especially if they come from different backgrounds, ideologies, and the things like that. And so something to keep your eye on is that trade-off between the desire to have diversity, different voices, be bipartisan, and can you make it work? And I predict to you that one of the things we're likely to see is a very strong desire to move in that direction, and some real challenges then in the early implementation about whether the team can get together. But I'd be interested also in your experience how much the idea of thinking about not only the individuals, but is this group going to work together well? Because if you look through history, it doesn't look like that has been a big consideration during transitions. That's one issue. On the process side, just to reiterate your point, I think that having done this on both sides, but mostly from the campaign side, there is little connection up until the moment of truth between the transition team and the people who are going to govern. And that is a real challenge because the people who are influential with the candidate, as you suggest, are in the campaign. If they matter, they want to be there, and not focus on the transition. The people who are doing the transition are thoughtful, smart, experienced, but they don't have this set of experiences. So the question is, I know the decision you all came to in 2004, which was important for the country, for President-elect Kerry to have a fast start, name people, but is that the right answer? I mean, given all these challenges, and given the fact that America uniquely in the world has this 3-month transition. I mean, most people, you have to start the next day, right? If you're elected prime minister in the UK, you're in office. Wouldn't it be better to resist the temptation and say, look, we're going to do this right, we're going to take our time, this is really the first time that the president-elect can really deal with these things, and say, I need to have this in place, let's say by January 1st, because Congress is going to come in and you want to be able to make those first nominations even before you're inaugurated, because the Congress is willing to begin the pre-work once Congress is sworn in, usually the first few days of January. But how would you, looking back on it, assess the trade-off between a fast start, reassuring the world and the American people that you know what you're doing, versus the cost that's paid? The last one on ideas, it's interesting when you look at the comparison between these Republican and Democratic transitions. You've given the, I think, accurate description of what happened in the Democratic side and some of the strengths of some of the Republican transitions. But what's distinctive about the Republican transitions, and again, I've been on the outgoing side of 2 of them, from Carter to Reagan, and then from Clinton to Bush, is that what happened was, in both cases, the new team came in with fully formed ideas and a plan, and complete disinterest in whatever had gone on before. And so when I was at the Justice Department in the Carter-Reagan transition, and we were very conscientious, and we prepared all these transition books, and wanted to brief our successors, understanding that they would make their choices, but at least wanted to understand all the things that we'd struggled with and all the conflicts, trade-offs. And they walked in and they said, something, we won and you lost, and just give us some space to work, and thank you very much. If we have any questions, we'll let you know. I mean, literally, I am not exaggerating, that this was, you guys were bad, incompetent, ineffective, and we're going to be good and effective, and we know what we're doing. And so, as you say, they had they had Stockman, and they had their plan, right? But it was just kind of, we're starting fresh. And I say this with due respect to our guests here. I mean, it was absolutely the same thing. I met a number of times. I knew my successors very well, and it was very cordial. Unlike the Reagan thing, which was not even cordial. I mean, it was, just get out of town as fast as you can. With the Bush people, very cordial. But it was also, something, we're not, whatever you did, Middle East peace process, we're not doing that, okay? We're not doing, and I think some of them were very problematic, and I'm not going to make the substantive points here. But it was just, we're going to go do our thing. And so I think you're right that they got fast starts, because they had a lot of plan, but it was largely because there wasn't much of an effort to sort of do this legacy bridging. And so I think there is, again, a trade-off there. Anyway, any comments on any of that, and then we'll go to...
Well, I think you raise a terrific point about could you do better, and could you get credit for doing better by moving more slowly? And my instinct is to think that not unlike taking over a deanship or taking over as CEO of a company, if you describe the time you need in a way that fits with the notion that you've got a center, core values, a perspective, and competence, I think then you can probably put some things on a little slower track and some things on a little faster track. On the other hand, action as a new CEO or as a new university president or whatever that takes advantage of the popular goodwill, that reinforces it, that you got the message, that you're doing it right, that healthcare is at the top of your agenda, that everybody has been talking about it at that point for a couple of years. I think if you lose the moment in some of these areas, there's really a pretty high price to pay. And so now, if you did a national security advisor, a secretary of state, and a White House chief of staff, could you then rest, for 3 weeks and say, we won't begin to announce cabinet choices until after Thanksgiving? And if you selected people who were considered to be first-tier players, and you described why you'd chosen them in a way that fit with the public mandate and the themes of your campaign, you might be able to buy 2 or 3 weeks. But for so many rounds now, the cabinet has basically been announced before Christmas. And then you look at the top half dozen at least, if not more, White House staff positions, which have typically been done in November. And I think if you, with this, the length of time now that it's taking to get people confirmed is growing and growing and growing. So that they're about 6 months longer now to get the confirmation process done in the Clinton administration than it was, back in the Kennedy administration. And so if you start doing things that looks like you don't really get the levers of power under control, till August or something, by the time you factor in the confirmation process, as a manager, it leads me to say I want to front load, and force the Congress, to deal with it, and not give them any excuses, that we're getting them nominations in the first week of March that we could have had in their hands in the first week of January. And so, the sort of, I guess it sort of underscores in my mind the notion that the sooner you get serious about the transition planning, the better prepared you are to move quickly. And the quicker you move, the more likely you are to get the momentum flowing your way. And so, if you just can't do it, I guess, to make big mistakes, as people have, where they've made cabinet selections they had to back off of or whatever, that's obviously harmful, painful, whatever. But other things being equal, I think my management orientation would say just do a lot as fast as you can with reasonable confidence that you're getting it right.
Okay, questions, comments? Mark?
You've talked a good deal about best practices, and Dean just kind of touched on maybe something that could be problematic. Can you talk a little bit about mistakes that are made or things to avoid or things that you've seen over transition exercises you can point to and say, boy, transition teams often sort of go this direction, it's really a mistake. So there's a couple of things you can point to say, avoid this.
This is Mark McKinnon, who is electing John McCain at the moment. I have actually a fabulous memo.
Can I copy it?
Yes, I was just going to say that was done by one of the most thoughtful people in the Democratic side about pitfalls in the transition process. And it kind of covers most of what Jim and I have talked about, mostly in terms of false starts, lack of discipline, letting your agenda slide away from you, not building on momentum, not building on the popular goodwill, not giving the American public enough about who you really are now that the race is over, and of course failure to integrate the transition planning with the campaign staff and kind of a wide range of things. Maybe Jim would have a more concise answer about most important pitfalls to avoid.
I do think Jim's hit on the main ones. I do think, there's a deep choice to be made, which is why I raised this point about timing, which is either you have to take transition more seriously during the campaign, or you have to, in my judgment, you have to give it more time. Because, my experience is exactly what Jim described, which is candidates don't want to touch it. And I'm not sure you can fix that. I'm just not sure you can fix it. You can make the argument that it's really in the interest of the country and it's a good way to spend the last month of the campaign, to spend a lot of time closeted up with. But boy, Mark, you know as well as I do that, maybe if you've got a runaway race and there's just no contest, you can do that. But if there's any kind of competitiveness, every moment is precious, and everybody's going to say to you, the campaign manager, the political advisors, the media advisors, are going to say, you can worry about that the day after. Right now, we've got to get you elected. And so tremendously good work goes on in these transition things. But your description of the Carter process is wonderful, because it's just what happens, which is that even if you get the Jim Johnsons of the world to run your transition, it's a whole new game with a whole new set of players the day afterwards. And so unless you've got a candidate who is so conscientious about the stuff and is prepared to look at that transition plan in September in its early iterations and say, no, that doesn't work for me, or have you looked at this, and really engage with it. And that takes time and mental concentration, which candidates are unlikely to give. And you really have to have, tee up the options for sure during the campaign, but take seriously the time to take a deep breath and say to yourself, okay, it's the big show now, and not feel trapped by the need to make it. I feel that's been my experience on the thing.
So did you demand briefing time on the schedule?
Yeah, I met with Kerry quite a lot, normally coming up in the freight elevator through some kitchen somewhere in some suite. And but he was, as I say, he was real jumpy about it all. And there's another dynamic here, which is I guess not fully consistent with a positive view of how the federal government might work. And that is that the federal government is basically set up to pull apart. And one of the big mistakes that was made in the Carter transition was that it was going more slowly. It was less centered in the White House than I think any of the Bush or Reagan transitions. And you would choose a secretary for a department, and then the top 15 appointments that needed to be done in that department kind of migrated over into the secretary's control as opposed to the president's control, and the priorities of that department migrated into the hands of the secretary rather than the hands of the president. And you say, well, that shouldn't really happen, because aren't we all on the same team, and so on. And once the enterprise of the federal government is not subject to presidential leadership, you have then got a mess on your hands of monumental proportions. You can say, well, in a business, you'd have a group vice president or a divisional vice president or a product line or whatever, that you would basically hand off to somebody. But the perception of how well the president is doing really is related to the White House and the president's definition of what they've set out to accomplish. And if all of a sudden you've got these individual cabinet departments doing things that they like, which doesn't fit with the president's agenda or cuts across the president's agenda, it's a mess. And So that one of the other dynamics here of going slower is that it seems to me it's much harder to maintain the kind of centralized control, at least I would prefer, for the president in the White House. And so, I mean, a lot of that happened to us in the Carter administration, where all of a sudden, we had cabinet secretaries, who were not literally but figuratively hard to reach.
No, I think, and I loved your point about Baker and sort of seeing this across the economic positions across the departments rather than, because for sure in the Clinton transition, I mean, what typically happens is each agency has its own transition team, and they're very disconnected to the rest of it. And so, I mean, again, one way of squaring the circle we've been talking about, slow, fast, is that if you can keep kind of functional things going in the early part of the transition, rather than having it happen by organizational thing, I think you could get considerable benefit out of that. So that rather than having a State Department transition and a Defense Department transition, to have a national security transition and to think through, how do the pieces all fit with each other, maybe some way of overcoming that. Frank?
That was absolutely fascinating presentation. You mentioned on a couple occasions the 1960 transition. It's obviously a much different time. I just want to look at it a little bit. There's a couple interesting things that happened there that I wonder if they could happen now. The first thing is that the Kennedy people, a very close election, yet for the two most important positions they picked Republicans, McNamara and Dillon. And, the Dillon
Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury.
The Dillon one actually angered a lot of people. Kenneth Galbraith, Ava Harriman, people like that were considered front runners for that. I wondered if you could comment on, when you have a close election, people really fighting, especially for change. It was considered a change election. And say you're running the transition, you're someone like Clark Clifford, how do you convince the president, or how do you work with the president to say, you need to reach out in these important positions? And then how do you deal with the people who have been obviously working really hard on a campaign, not to get two Republicans in some important positions, to get a bunch of Democrats in? It turns out that it was the right thing to do, right? Dillon and McNamara ended up being very good appointments. But if you could explain that dynamic and whether in this day and age that's even possible or conceivable. And the second question involves this national security issue. It's very interesting to hear whether I can see the argument for starting quickly is you have important issues that you have to deal with, and they don't go away. 3 months is a long time in the world of national security. On the other hand, these are important positions. You want to wait. And the two successful Republican administrations, as Jim argued, kind of ignored the advice from the past. And one of the things that, there's another reason I think to take these transition meetings seriously is that they become issues of historical record. So there's obviously some historical record in the transition from Clinton to Bush in the Eisenhower to Kennedy period. There's big controversy about what Eisenhower told the Kennedy people about Vietnam, what they should do. There's literally 6 different memos about what was actually said, and they all disagree. I'm wondering how, for someone who's running a transition, how those meetings are arranged, what are the ground rules? On the one hand, you'd like to believe in terms of national security, people are going to say this is more important than partisan elections. On the other hand, you have a team coming in and saying, we won, you lost. How is that managed and handled and discussed? Because 1960 does seem to be an interesting test case, and one where things were handled pretty effectively.
I'll try to be brief. I assume we're running out of time pretty quickly. But let me, I think a lot of this, your first question, I think a lot is going to be defined by the campaign of 2008. I happen to be an Obama supporter, so take what I say with a slight grain of salt. But I think Obama first, and probably McCain second, and Hillary Clinton third, are laying a lot of groundwork now for the notion that business in Washington should be done differently. And I think as we go through the next several months, I would expect Obama particularly, once again, to go substantially further down that road. As he goes through the primary process, there's a lot of that's the way they used to do it in Washington. That's what's caused the problem, where he means both Clinton and Bush. And I think that there's going to be the press and in the debate process and other things, I think there's going to be a further pushing of Obama to say, okay, so it's going to be so different. It's not the past. It's not the bad old ways. You know, what's the good new way? And I would guess that he will go down the road of saying, you know, the spoils do not necessarily belong to the victor. The country belongs to a broad-based coalition of people who want to do a better job, who are more optimistic about what we can accomplish. And so, you know, if he happens to be the next president, I think a lot of this is going to, in fact, be kind of pulled out of him as we go through this process. And so, therefore, it might be easier to do it. It might be more harmful not to do it, and that you may have kind of laid in the next several months a kind of expectation that things will not be so partisan and will be more oriented to something that is fundamentally different. In terms of the quality of the advice and the nature of the advice of the outgoing people, I don't know what to say about that exactly. When Mondale came in as vice president in 76, 77, you know, there was a lot of focus then on the past definitions of the office being irrelevant. And Jimmy Carter, to his credit, more than Walter Mondale. I mean, Carter came to Mondale, and I happened to be with him at the time, and said, you know, this is going to be fundamentally different. You know, we're going to make a big sea change here in the way the vice presidency works. And, you know, and of course it has changed. I'll leave to Dan Bartlett to conclude whether or not it has now gone completely haywire in the present circumstance. But but we have over the time of Mondale, you know, up through you know, Bush 41 and Gore and Cheney, you know, the vice presidency has gotten progressively more muscular. And but there was a very widespread feeling in 76 that it was kind of a wasted office, and that therefore there wasn't much to be learned from a backward look. On the other hand, I think that there are many circumstances where the outgoing president, I think Eisenhower, at least as far as my history can take me, is an example of somebody who tried to be very thoughtful on departure. And I don't, you know, and it's not like there are lots of jobs like being president of the United States, and so you can go, you know, call the phone book and get, you know, a lot of good advice. And so I at least would have a bias towards a series of meetings, probably a more structured agenda, maybe even the president with his top 3 or 4 people, with the incoming president with his top 3 or 4 people, and see if you couldn't pull out of this, you know, something that was substantially more meaningful. Now, whether you could ever pull that off or not, I don't have any idea.
Look over here. Right.
You mentioned change a lot, and I was wondering what you think is the offsetting impact of this reliance on institutional knowledge, particularly in the transition between political parties when people have been sidelined for 4 or 8 years. And so what you really need is someone who understands the process, understands the institutions, and you're relying on people who have ideas from a decade ago, 20 years ago. How much room for change is there really when Washington relies so heavily on institutional knowledge, on bureaucracy as a method of functioning?
Great question. And I have very little. Well, let me just say what I think, and then whether it has merit or not, we can vote on. I think that there now is a permanent community in places like the LBJ School and Brookings and a wide variety of other places that allows people out of government to stay remarkably current, and with a combination of deep connections to the bureaucracy as well as you know, just following every dimension of every legislative proposal and the actions on Capitol Hill and the testimony of the administration and why they want this and why they don't want that and what goes into the appropriations instructions and the appropriations committees. And I think we probably have less of a gap between those who are actually on the inside and those who are on their way to the inside than many people would think. And so if you say, well, even though they come from a different party and even though they may have a different perspective on universal health insurance or on Iraq, what are the chances that people are that fully informed are also fresh and creative thinkers? That's a companion to your question, which is a deeper even question, and that is, I don't know how much knowledge and detailed knowledge particularly squeezes out the fresh look, the creativity, whatever. And I think sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And part of a president's instincts in terms of where things really need to be shaken up and where the assumptions need to be shaken up, define the kind of people that get chosen. And all of a sudden you turn up one day and you've got a Secretary of Transportation, who doesn't only want to build more highways, and maybe even is aware that there's something called a bicycle that people might want to use, and or that there might be some sort of and so I think it's probably less to do with the kind of detailed knowledge and more to do with the mindset and creativity, at least from my point of view.
I vote for that. I mean, it's a great answer. And the only slight exception I'd make, and it's at least on the national security side, is I think that there was a problem for the Clinton administration in the first term. The Democrats have been out of office for all but 4 of 24 years, right? And the people who came in, frankly, didn't know what they were. I mean, I honestly believe that, and I was connected to this, so this is, I feel relatively well positioned to say this, is that you had very few people that had senior jobs at national security level who came in, and they've been out for a long time. And I do think there was a problem there of just sort of, on the one hand, not knowing whether to follow the predecessor, not quite knowing how to use what to use and what not to use from the legacy and the institutional stuff. But I think Jim's answer is an excellent one. Paul? Oh, go ahead.
You say the Carter people knew they were going to win? Clinton people?
Is there any indication that this year the Democrats win, the process is going to be any better? In terms of just the way the party is built in terms of caucuses and interest groups?
I would say there's no indication that it would be better. There's also no reason it can't be better. But at the moment, it would take a pretty bold approach by the Democratic nominee to figure out what was really important and how to avoid a lot of the mistakes that have been made in the past. And there are lots of interest groups who are going to want to be satisfied, and so it's not impossible. But when you're trying to build as broad a coalition as possible to win, most politicians don't feature bad news during that process, and or at least most successful politicians. And so, I think you're fighting against the odds. I think the basic premise of your question is correct. You're fighting against the odds, and if you can do better than expected, people should really take their hats off to you.
And just to reinforce this problem that we started talking about with Mark too, is about the problem of why things don't happen before the election. is that if you start tipping your hand on these things, you're already starting to make choices and disappointing your own people, right? And you know, if you're leaning to this kind of Secretary of HHS who is known to have a particular view, there may be somebody who doesn't like that. And so you have a pretty broad incentive until the election to make everybody feel they have a shot at it, all the interest groups feeling like their issue will be the number one and the like. So it's just another one of those reasons why people, I think candidates are very reluctant to kind of get too much into the nitty-gritty there.
You know, there's another dimension about this, and that is that the Republicans traditionally have been, and maybe in their DNA somehow that hasn't been discovered, but they are substantially better at keeping their mouths shut than Democrats. And, you know, so that on the Democratic side, you know, the old Washington notion that, you know, anytime two people know something, it's no longer a secret. You know, the Republicans have been pretty good at keeping secrets. And, you know, Jack and I were talking this morning, when I did the vice presidential selection process for Kerry, I've discovered a key to keeping secrets, which is vitally important, and that is that it's easier to do if you don't tell anybody. Right? And so if we could imagine a situation where we were doing a presidential transition planning where people knew how to keep their mouth shut, you know, you might be able to make more progress.
Back over here. Okay.
Are there any other dynamics that come into play when the incoming president is of a different party or was not part of the prior administration? From what you've already mentioned.
Yes. And I mean, I think, you know, imagining John McCain as a chief executive, you know, is not so easy, right? I think people might say the same thing about Barack Obama. You know, Hillary Clinton has been in and around it so much more that I think has a very orderly sort of approach to most things. But yeah, I mean, I would guess if it's McCain or Obama, how they turn out to function as executive officers of this most complex enterprise in the world, I think I happen to, as you can tell, I kind of like McCain as a Republican and I like Obama as a Democrat, and so I'm not, you know, overwhelmingly depressed about it. But I think in the first 9 months of either of those administrations, you know, it could be an interesting ride.
And just the flip side also true. I mean, for the classic story on the national security side, by far the best transition was Reagan to Bush, where you had people who absolutely knew what they were doing. They knew each other. It's the one time we've had a team in place that knew how to operate as a team, and so it's kind of the textbook for everybody. I mean, there were other problems in terms of how the world was changing and were they adapting to change over time, but in terms of getting a good start, I mean, they did a terrific job. Travis.
You've talked a lot about the difficulties and tensions that come along when selections are made for possible cabinet positions that go cross-party, Democrat or Republican. But I'm interested, especially in this particular election that is so even, especially on the Democratic side, how difficult will it be for, let's say, if Barack Obama gets the nomination, to make choices among people that supported Hillary or vice versa? Is that going to be as difficult, more difficult?
I think that it will, by and large, not be very difficult. You know, I think there are a couple of people, you know, who probably distinguished themselves here to the point where they'd be unlikely to be appointed by the winner if it's from the other side. I mean, there's a fellow who argued the impeachment on the floor of the United States Senate named Greg Craig, a very talented lawyer at Williams and Conley, who's a big Obama supporter. I wouldn't think he'd be high on a Clinton appointment list. I wouldn't sense, you know, if Obama was elected, that Bill Clinton would probably be sent out on a mission unless it had something to do with Antarctica. You know, so, you know, I think it'll be, you know, there'll be a few who kind of don't work. But I think 99% of people who happen to have been for Hillary Clinton or happen to have been for Obama, I think they'll be considered to be just fine.
Last question.
Oh.
You, yes?
Has there ever been a consideration of a bipartisan transition team that sort of dealt with collecting the best lessons learned from the current administration and sort of doing some of the vetting on shortlists that would be pleasing to both sides? I mean, just to take away some of that work, and then both teams could work on the strategy alone?
Not that I know of.
Or do you think it would be possible or useful?
I think there might be some dimensions of trust that would be hard to establish. Now, there is a bipartisan group at the moment that was running around in the thought that maybe Bloomberg would be a possible third-party candidate, and former senators from both parties and other quote-unquote distinguished Americans were thinking that maybe there was a way here of having a different way of doing this kind of thing. And my own view is that Bloomberg is now highly unlikely to run if it turns out to be McCain and Obama, or even McCain and Clinton. You know, if it had been Clinton and Romney or something, you know, I think Bloomberg would have run, and they would have made a full-scale effort to try to look and sound like a truly bipartisan enterprise that was highly competent and highly committed to doing a better job at governing. But I think the Bloomberg presidency has already come and gone.
Was it successful?
Didn't do any major harm.
Well, Jim, thank you. It's a rare and unique insight into something that I know most of us don't often get to see, and so thank you for coming and spending time with us here.
Happy to be here.